So yes, I think we should start. And I have to present Dr. And Adje both. For me, it's a pleasure because we have a long professional and personal relationship. And he's one of the best known music archaeologists nowadays. He's nowadays also senior research fellow at the University of Huddersfield with a Marie Curie research grant. He's going to talk about it today. He's also chair of the ICTM study group of music archaeology, but he's also a very active member of the international study group of music archaeology and one of the regular editors of the volumes. He's a founder of Eco Verlag, the only scholar publishing house that is mainly focused in music archaeology. And his main field of expertise is pre-Columbian music archaeology, but well, we have to say that his expertise is music archaeology in general, as he's also a regular exhibition curator for several chronologies and also a varied set of geographical locations in which musical instruments are found. Probably I have forgotten many things. You have done, but it's better to, I think, to listen to you and to give you the time.
Okay, thank you, Raquel, and hello to everyone. I don't see you, but I hope you are all well and sit comfortable at your homes. I'm here in Poland, and today I will speak about my current project, the Teotihuacan Sound Mapping Project, exploring the sonic sphere of the City of the Gods, Mexico. The image that you see here, I hope you all can see that, is of a priest impersonating, transforming into a jaguar. So actually, the only element which is priest-like remaining here is this large headdress of feathers that this jaguar is wearing. And in his left paw, the jaguar holds a shell horn. These instruments are quite common in all the pre-Columbian Americas, so it's not surprising that in the Teotihuacan culture, that instrument was also employed. I have one of these shells here, which I can show you. It's quite large instruments. This is Fasciolora princeps from the Pacific coast. And you see my head, it's a beautiful sound when you listen to it. What you see here, and I'm now looking to have that pointer. Yeah, I hope you see this pointer now, that the shell is fitted with a mouthpiece. And this is exceptional in the pre-Columbian Americas, but it is something which I find in all kind of music imagery of Teotihuacan shell horns. There are lots of murals, fresco paintings in Teotihuacan found, depicting shell horns and other instruments such as rattles. And they are always fitted with a mouthpiece. What you also see are elements which are called sound scrolls or volutes, which are coming out of the horn. And these elements are also frequently found in Teotihuacan music depictions, actually showing sound, sometimes also water flows or smoke, but mostly referring to sound. So when I'm looking at the depictions, Teotihuacan mural depictions, and there were found lots of them all over the city, I find in really so many depictions of Teotihuacan these sound scroll elements, these volutes, and which is a sign for sound which apparently was all over that ancient city. So I will now start with a brief introduction into my project. This is an EU-funded project. I might also call it an adventure, because actually it's a kind of explorative adventure which I'm carrying out here. And I'm exploring the soundscapes of the urban environment of the archaeological UNESCO World Heritage Site of Teotihuacan. It's a UNESCO World Heritage since the 1970s. And this site is situated in the highlands of central Mexico. In a moment, I will also give a brief introduction into that culture. So referring to the Teotihuacan soundscapes, there are several processes which I'm performing here. The first one is that the sound tools and musical instruments of the site, and there are hundreds of finds, are studied and reconstructed. There's a lot of instrument making and technology involved, of course, and that is quite experimental archaeology process, of course. It's not only me doing this, so I'm doing this together with experienced instrument makers. And this process of reconstructing, replicating these diverse musical instruments of Teotihuacan is well advanced now. Also, the instruments then subsequently, of course, are sounded and recorded. First in laboratory conditions, that is in studio environments, professional studio environments, but also in different architectural settings of the site. So we are carrying out experimental playing here because we have no idea about the music which was played on these instruments. We have the tools, but we do not have any trace of the music. There are no recordings, there's no notation. Which is a pity on the one hand, but on the other hand also gives us a certain freedom, of course, in recreating music images of Teotihuacan on the basis of original reconstructed sounds. So the first tests on site were carried out in the last year before the pandemic. Then there was the first structural analysis planned for March this year, which then could not be performed. And so this is unfortunately a process which is, let's say, stopped. And I hope that now in March next year, so with 1 year of waiting, I can carry out this important research, because this is actually one of the most important steps of my research project. Recordings in the studio were carried out and are also still carried out. Then the third process is that the instrumental and architectural acoustics of Teotihuacan are analyzed. We are doing this on hand of what I called geo-referenced sound mapping, which basically means that different instruments are played in different spots of the site that is GPS tracked, and then we are analyzing the response of certain sounds in certain settings of the urban environment of Teotihuacan, which is partly reconstructed. Then also in a later process, we might include 3D modeling here and generate 3D models of the site, and then also make acoustic tests, virtual acoustic tests, but that would be something which could be carried out after this research project. It's not actual part of it currently. So then there are other aspects of this project which are more artistic related. Of course, experimental playing is an artistic activity, especially if I work with professional musicians, and I'm working together with professional musicians. And so this process I call contemporary experimental music and composition. It's a very important aspect of my project. And on one hand, a sample pack of Teotihuacan original sounds and reconstructed sounds is created and handed over to musicians and sound artists who then could just do whatever they would like to do with these recordings. We are also creating, as part of the process of the instrument manufacture, 3D models of these instruments. We are carrying out CT scans of the reconstructions and then modify these scans further in virtual models, then print them out and print them out in series. That's the plan. So that is a process which also just started now. I only now have the first CT scans made, but then I have one model of one instrument type, and it's always exactly the same model, which, and this is planned, is then distributed to different musicians worldwide, who then can get along with these instruments, practice, and generate music. So what one of the basic result of this will sound I call these sound images of the site, which are going to be created. And actually this is soundscape recreation, and there's of course a lot of sound design involved in this. And there is the first results of this process are already there. There you see the link. I also put the link in the chat. In the first comment in the chat, you will find the link to these recordings. It's 4 tracks. The first 3 tracks are experimental electronic music with some Teotihuacan sounds. And the 3rd track is pure Teotihuacan sound, which is really interesting. And I'm very happy that we have the first results of this process, but I'm intending to work much more with more musicians here. Everyone interested, maybe this is the moment I could say this, everyone interested to join this project in terms of performing, playing, recording, and so on is welcome. The final output of the project is a virtual sound map, which is going to be created of the site of Teotihuacan. One version of that sound map will be an interactive online sound map, which you see here, a first draft of the website, which well, I can also, I just see that comment, I can also place that link later on. It's the first comment in the chat room. I see it. Anyway, we can sort it out later. So here you see an image of this website, which is going to be created. You see the site of Teotihuacan, which we made as a kind of treasure map, which could be explored. And you see the different pins there on different spots of the city where a certain instrument was found, which then could be heard, or maybe where also a sound event is taking place, some actual recording which we did on site and which then could be explored on that website. The website will give a general introduction into this project, of course, and it would also just list all these different instruments and give some accompanying information on these instruments. But in a way, it's a first version of this sound map which we are going to create. The final sound map will be virtual, and it will be, you could imagine, it's not existing so far. We are working on this. It's something for the 3rd year of the project. It will be an application for mobile phones, which the visitors of the site could download. And all the different recordings which we did on site, also in the studios, are going to be found in this application, and they are geo-referenced. That means when the people then walk through the visitors walk through the actual site, they are just not only standing in front of silent pyramids, but everywhere where they are standing in front of a temple, or they are in a courtyard, and there is a sound event where we recorded specific instruments in the actual environment of Teotihuacan, then there maybe is a little vibration or a little signal popping up, and the people then could listen to this sound event at the proper place. And in a way, we are going to create a kind of sound walk event, which is then accessible all over the site, or let's say the public accessible areas of the site, and which is of course interactive, because the people can walk freely. Maybe we are providing this kind of treasure map for download and print also, which the visitors then could have while walking through the city, but it's actually not needed. And this project actually will be a model for hopefully future projects, because this is of course something which we could also apply for any kind of other archaeological sites worldwide. Let's just think about Pompeii, for example, and the amount of sound tools which were found all over the city of Pompeii. Something very similar could be created there as well. So that is basically the project. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the site of Teotihuacan. It's found in central Mexico, not so far from Mexico City. It's about 40 kilometers north of Mexico City, at an altitude of 2,200 meters roughly. So it's quite high. And you notice this when climbing on one of these large pyramids, of course. The air is not so thick there. The culture existed in the late pre-classic and classic period of Mesoamerica between 100 BC and AD 650, 750, more or less contemporary to ancient Rome. But what is really interesting is that metallurgy was not known in this site, and also not in contemporary sites of Mesoamerica. For example, the Maya culture was contemporary in South Mexico, and the metallurgy only arrived later in Mesoamerica, which is really interesting. We have, in fact, a Stone Age culture here, which is highly advanced. If in a moment you see some simulation how that actual city looked like. You see here an image which I took in December 2019 on one of the hills, and I took this photo towards the valley of Teotihuacan, and these two hills which are here coming out of these fields are actual pyramids. They look like mountains, and they are actually mountains. They are quite huge pyramids. Actually, this one here, the so-called Sun Pyramid, is one of the largest pyramids ever built in the Americas. This somewhat smaller structure is the so-called Moon Pyramid. I'm now just giving these names because later, from time to time, I will refer to these large structures. Teotihuacan, the site of Teotihuacan was huge. It was, archaeologists estimated roughly 21 square kilometers of site extension. It was really huge. Currently, the site is surrounded. The archaeological zone, which is open to the public, is surrounded by little villages. Here you see a little bit of that. And this circle more or less gives the dimension that the site of Teotihuacan had. Let's see. Yes, there's a canvas of painted in 1878, giving an impression of Teotihuacan before the actual excavations started to be carried out. You see that image is taken from the moon pyramid, from the top of the moon pyramid towards the sun pyramid. And this here is a large procession street of roughly 4.5 kilometers in length. It was really very, very long and very, very wide. Here you see an image how it looks today after partial excavation and restoration. Here you see this the street, and here you see lots of different mounds and courtyards and patios which are not excavated, but that image is somewhat misleading because lot of structures were excavated all around these larger structures here. This is another image of the Sun Pyramid before the actual excavations took place. Here we see the same structure nowadays. That is another photo that I took in December last year. And maybe you see some little dots here on the surface of that pyramid, and these are actual people. So it's quite large structure. And of course, all these structures had their architectural acoustics. I will come to this a little bit later. This is 3D simulation, how that site actually looked like. All structures were covered with stucco and painted. The stucco was also polished, and that of course contributed to the sound characteristics, because polished stucco has a high reverb factor. Now I got it. Has a very high reverb factor, and this of course would need to be calculated when we are now trying to reconstruct the architectural acoustics in the urban environment of that city. Left and right of this large procession street, here you see a little section of this moon pyramid, the second largest structure. Left and right there were temples, courtyards, patios, altars, sunken plazas, platforms, temples, and residential compounds. And they basically looked like this. Certain parts were excavated and substructures were excavated, and all surfaces were covered with mural paintings. Here is another image, just only now for you to have an idea how that city looked like. That's one of the palaces that had fully stone relief carvings painted. And you see this large open courtyard. All these courtyards, of course, had particular acoustics. And here you see one of the smaller residential compounds which were all around the ceremonial center of that city, also with open small courts, also with little temples, sometimes one, sometimes 3, 4, 5 temple structures, lots of quarters around which were roofed and which were arranged around the patios. These residential compounds had 1 or 2 entrances of access and were then surrounded, all the rest was just surrounded by walls. Sorry, I have to drink something. So this is more or less my little introduction to Teotihuacan, to the culture. Already the first excavations which took place there, that was in 1884 to 1888, sorry, yielded sound instruments, musical instruments, and also mural paintings, frescoes showing instruments. Here, that was an excavation of the so-called Temple of Agriculture. It was called Temple of Agriculture because there's lots of agricultural products shown in the murals of this temple. And one of these murals, which nowadays is not existing anymore, lots of information from this time is actually lost because the murals simply faded away. But luckily we have these paintings of them. And what you see here are shell horns, a mountain of shell horns, or let's say probably an offering of shell horns, of 7 shell horns each. And you see here again these sound scrolls or volutes emanating the horns. Interestingly, the horns sound on their own. It's not a jaguar playing the horn here. They just sound on their own, just like the shell, which is sounding on its own. But interestingly, it is this scene here is placed in an aquatic environment, and of course underwater shell horns could not produce any sound. So that is for sure a symbolic mythological scene here. You see some underwater creatures. You see the symbol of waves here. This is also a symbol of water. So it's all placed in the sea, maybe the lake of the Valley of Mexico, not so far from Teotihuacan, which was the major source for subsistence, fishing, hunting, and so on. So these are the earliest images that we have, and already instrument depictions were found. I'm not talking today much about music imagery of Teotihuacan. That would be another whole lecture, because there are, I don't know, maybe 70, 80, 90 depictions of different instruments placed all over the city. But these images, of course, will be included finally in the Teotihuacan sound map with accompanying information, what's it all about, or what we think what's it all about. So most recently, I'm now bridging 140 years of excavation history in Teotihuacan. There are lots of excavations took place all over these many decades. Lots of instruments were found in many different excavations, but actually no one so far, and that's interesting, no one so far had a look at these finds. I'm working on the Teotihuacan musical instruments since 2008, and so far still I'm the only one doing it. Even in Mexico, there are so many archaeologists and also music archaeologists interested in the music of the pre-Columbian Americas, but Teotihuacan actually is totally unexplored so far. In a way, I'm a pioneer here, although there are excavations for more than 140 years. So this excavation here is one of the latest, largest excavation projects in Teotihuacan, and that took place in a temple which is the 3rd largest structure in Teotihuacan, the so-called Temple of the Feathered Serpent. And there was a tunnel excavated, quite large, over 40 meters long tunnel with 3 chambers at the end of that tunnel, and it is a fully fully artificial cave. It looks like a cave, but it's fully artificial, There were several offerings found, and one of these was this one here. Here you see an image of that tunnel, and here you see that offering with large stone figures and this hill of shell horns. Over 20 shell horns of these were excavated here in the form of a kind of mound placed on top of lots of smashed sherds of vases and vessels. And I just want to make that bridge here because this is so interesting. One of the earliest excavations showing this mural of shell horns, and then this excavation in that tunnel with these shell horns. And probably, so that is one of my interpretations here, these murals of the Temple of Agriculture actually show such a shell horn offering, which was excavated just a few years ago. So music imagery and actual finds are kind of counterparts here, and if put together, we can come to interesting results. What's next? Yes, these are instruments. I just want to show you the fine distribution here of certain Teotihuacan instruments. You see the map showing roughly the side extension of the site. Here's the Sun Pyramid, there's the Moon Pyramid, and here is the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. That is this large procession street of 4.5 kilometers. And we have, for example, these instruments, these kind of small tubular trumpets, ceramic trumpets I can play. And these instruments, or let's say fragments of them, were found, as you see here, all over the site. There are hundreds and hundreds of fragments of these instruments which we could document, and the actual placing of these findings is well noted down, so we could generate these kind of maps. I'm intending to generate these fine distribution maps for all kind of different instruments found in Teotihuacan. And it's interesting when you compare this to other instrument finds, such as these so-called quadruple flutes because these instruments are composed of 4 tubes. I have one here, and I will also play this in a moment. And when comparing the fine distribution.
Adje, can I remind people that they can see you, if they click on your image, they can see you better, and not in a small size, but in larger size.
Yes, when I play, maybe it's nice, then you see that that instrument better, right? Yeah, so when comparing this with the tubular cylindrical trumpets, then you see that these instruments are, let's say, more exclusive, more rarely found, and also found in certain areas of the city. And this, of course, will tell us a lot about the actual use or also symbolic meaning or employment of such instrument in different areas of the city and or by different societies within the city. So I'm exploring this aspect as well. Then I might switch to the next part of my presentation, and that is experimental instrument reconstruction. And that will be now the major part of my presentation. Unfortunately, as I stated earlier, we could not carry out much recordings on site yet. So all this analysis, and of course then also that virtual sound map, is something which is then hopefully going to be carried out next year. And then I might also be able to show some results or ongoing processes. So what I'm able to do now is show you the diversity of musical instruments which were reconstructed or reproduced so far. You'll see here one of my instrument makers, Osvaldo Perez, is a Mexican, but he lives in the Netherlands, fortunately, so he can come to my farm in Poland from time to time. We have a workshop here, and we can really put our heads together for a week or so and really highly concentrated work on the reconstructions, and we are exploring a lot here, and we are also finding out a lot of, let's say, mysteries of these instruments or information which we otherwise then in reproducing them could not be obtained. We produced a kiln, which you see here on the right side, for burning larger objects, but we also burn on the open fire. Here in this case, we used a metal grid, but also we just put the objects in the fire, or let's say we put them into the fireplace and then surrounded the objects slowly but slowly by fire, and then slowly but slowly over a long process of 1, 2, 3 hours, slowly but slowly covered the objects with little pieces of wood, so that there was fire all over the pieces. And then in the next morning we excavated the objects out of the ashes, and that worked perfectly well. So both methods, kiln burning and open fire burning, was practiced in Teotihuacan. And of course that is low temperature burning, which means that these objects are not so durable. And the effects of this you will see in a moment. Talking about these instruments which I showed earlier, and we spent a lot of time in reconstructing these quadruple flutes. Actually, there are 2 original finds of them which were found more or less intact, but badly restored. As you can see here, these areas were not found intact and were restored. And also here, these somewhat darker areas were restored. And nowadays we know that that restoration was carried out in a bad way, because certain finger holes were not employed, or the length of certain tubes is not the right one, or is not the one that we think. And going to the next image, yes, here you see the different position of finger holes, which we now test out in a series of experimental models. We know more or less the configuration of these finger hole placement, because beside of these 2 more or less intact finds, there are about 150 fragments of these instruments found. It's interesting that that they come along in 2 sizes, which is quite unusual for Mesoamerica. Usually you have cultures and they employed a certain instrument type, and these instruments are always roughly more or less coming in the same size. But here in Teotihuacan, we have several instrument types which come along in different sizes. And that's, of course, a sign of a very yeah, a particular sign of a particular instrument culture, because of course instrument type, which is basically has the same form but comes in different sizes, produces then also different tonal ranges, and this of course is a step towards kind of orchestration. But of course, one has to say here that we do not know if these instruments were actually played together or not. But it's possible. So then there is another one which I wanted to show you here, and that is something which we just figured out by doing this reconstruction process, in taking measurements and then applying these finger holes according to the original measurements of these instruments. And we found out that the of the right tube of the instruments, the second finger hole is always placed in the center in a 50-50 measurement between the distal end of the pipe and the aperture where the sound is actually generated in this flute. So that is something which was apparently applied, and it's certainly part of pre-Columbian flute design. And from this onwards then, all other finger holes were placed in these instruments. And there is another one, yes, and this shows this aperture air duct design, which is quite particular in these instruments. You don't find this particular design of the aperture of the window in other pre-Columbian flutes, and also not in Western flutes. This kind of shape is really interesting, and in earlier reproductions and tests which were carried out by musicians or other instrument makers over the last, let's say, decade or so, they did not actually reproduce this configuration, and therefore also the reconstructions which existed so far of these instruments in the hands of different musicians, purely musicians basically, also sound in a different way. Now that we figured out how to produce this, and it's actually quite complicated to produce these mouthpiece aperture edge configuration here, and we were actually spending more than a couple of hours in order to gut it, how it's done. Now we know it, and now also we know how the actual sound of this instrument was, and it was really very particular. Here you see different reconstructions made. You see that we are testing different finger hole positions, which we found, as I stated earlier, on other fragments of these instruments. And it's quite interesting that the two right tubes from the playing position, the two right tubes, A and B, I call them A, B, A, B, A, B, and then C, D. These two tubes always have 3 finger holes. The placement of 3 might have symbolic value here, because 3 was a very important number in Teotihuacan. And then there are 2, I thought, finger holes. But then when holding these instruments and playing them, we figured out that they are actually not reachable, especially not in these very large size of these instruments, and you would need to apply very strange positions in order to reach these holes. But interestingly, if you notice here, there's always a shift in the placement of the finger holes, which works nicely when holding the instrument and playing with one hand, Auloy style, you might call it. So you are holding not like this, you hold like this. But then you have these tone holes, which then reverse this little sound deviation which is produced, because the length of the two tubes is the same, but there is a deviation in the placement. That means that the sounds generated are slightly not in unison. But then the placement of these two tone holes brings back a kind of unison. But it's only a kind of unison. It's never in tune. So there are always deviations. And apparently that was desired. It was not desired to play in tune on one of these instruments, because actually, yes, you have 4 tones which are simultaneously generated here, but it was desired to play these microtonal deviations on them. And that, of course, is a sign of how that music might have looked like. So these are the most recent reconstructions. We are just reproducing, and with each model that we create, we find something else. So I could just endlessly talk about this, but of course I also want to show you some other instruments. But now that I talked a lot, I also would like to play a little bit, so you can have an idea of the sound. And I now step a little bit back so that you see better what is going on, but still I would need to go back. I hope you still hear me. Just a little impression of how these instruments sound. And of course, the larger ones, and I can show you just briefly, where do I have it? Sorry, I have to go there. That is the size of the large one. So big it is, quite heavy also. We still did not manage to produce the ceramics so fine that the weight is reduced, because we measured the original fines, and the weight is much lighter of them. And then it's of course also easier to hold them for a while. And here there's another finger hole. I'm just not moving my fingers, but I can play these instruments in different, let's say, ranges, in applying different pressure of my different air pressure while blowing. So actually now I need my professional musicians, because I'm just fiddling around with them. I'm not a professional musician, but of course I try to give my best now, so that you can just have an idea of the sounds. But as I stated earlier, there is this link, and fourth piece is also a kind of sound image of recordings made with these quadruple flutes which we produced here. Okay, this I wanted to refer earlier. Low temperature burning means that that these objects are fragile, and in handling, in playing, in moving, in producing, in firing these instruments, of course. Yes, there is a link. You just scroll up and you see the first comment, and I put the link there. You'll find it.
I'm sorry, but the people that joined later cannot see the previous chat.
Oh,
so
okay.
you can
Then I will place that link in the very end of the lecture, and then you all can have it. So sorry, I didn't know that.
Thank
you. Yes, so we are just producing a lot of damage, which is not so bad because we're producing a lot of instruments, and there is an interesting byproduct in this unintentional damaging. Now I'm also applying intentional damaging, by the way, but during this process we figure out that the fragmentation of the instruments is exactly the same like the fragmentation of the instruments which took place in previous times in Teotihuacan. So that has certain implications, of course. One for us, that the reconstructions that we are carrying out are actually accurate, but also when having a look at small pieces, that is really important information for archaeologists. So we can now prepare a small guideline for archaeologists. Usually archaeologists are not specialized in music, we all know that, or musical instruments, and it's just so frequently that fragments of instruments are excavated but not noticed or not classified as musical instruments. Now I can prepare a certain guideline of fragments and say, look, if you find a little piece which looks like this, it's part of a quadruple flute. If you find a little piece like this which looks very strange, it's a part of a quadruple flute. If you find a little tube like this, and there are hundreds of these, thousands maybe, of these little tubes, sometimes you see the embouchure, sometimes you see a little part of the bell, then it's maybe easier, but in many cases you just have these little tubes, which previously, sometimes they have these little rings, which just previously formed part of these cylindrical trumpets. Now I can tell the archaeologists, look at these instruments and you know what it actually is. I have probably more. Yes, for example, these so-called piston whistles, they are interesting. They have this little ceramic cylinder included into the pipe. The pipe is semi-closed here. It's not fully closed, but semi-closed. You can see it here. And this little cylinder is also called a piston, and it moves in this tube of the pipe, which has no finger hole, but due to the movement, the sound then generated is modified. So let's say an archaeologist finds such a little piece, a pebble in cylindric form. It might have formed part of such an instrument. Really important information, I think. I can play this, and I play two of them at the same time. Why I do this? Because in another culture, in a contemporary culture in the Gulf Coast of Mexico, contemporary Veracruz, there were found instruments which have the same principle, and they have like two tubes joined. In Teotihuacan, they only found this, not joined, but of course you could play them again alloy style, but no finger holes, simultaneously. You hear the piston, which moves inside. And now I play that. First of all, you would hear microtonal deviation of sound, the beat. It didn't move. We are really puzzling and trying to produce this, that this thing is moving, and it's just a question of less than millimeters, of course. It's not so easy to produce these instruments. They look quite simple, but it's really difficult to produce them and also difficult to play them. Here we go. That is the sound effect. So I have to move upwards and downwards, and then the piston moves and also the sound moves. That's it, basically, which can be created on these instruments. And of course, we have no idea what they have done with them. Yeah, I will probably respond to questions later. So other instruments which we are actually not reproducing because they are composed of natural material, which just need to be obtained, are these kind of clappers, turtle shell clappers. I'm talking a lot about flutes and trumpets and horns, but of course there are all other kind of different instruments which were found in Teotihuacan, and among these are these turtle shell clappers, which has such a beautiful sound. I have this turtle shell here, and they were played with the antler of a deer, and the sound is like this. That's it. Other instruments, and I will just now review. It now will take a while to review all these instruments, but then I'm also coming to an end. Other instruments are rasps, which are also made on deer antler, but also on human bone, on femur. And the sound, you could imagine it, it's like this. For many instruments, we do not have any idea what they have done with them, because there are no depictions of them in the frescoes, in the murals, and there's only a few finds maybe of such instruments. Not all are found in the masses. So some are more exclusive apparently, or the material didn't survive, which is of course also something. These turtle shells here, they decay quite rapidly, and only in certain environments may be preserved. But for many instruments, we do not have any idea what their meaning and their employment in the ritual music or the court music, the music of the priests. Of course, we know that, or could imagine that, let's say, shell horns or these little cylindric trumpets were used for intra-site communication in order to announce something, or in certain ceremonies on top of the pyramids. But for many other instruments, we just have no clue. Others are these shells, and they are actually not finally produced, because you would need to cut the tip of the spire, then the wall of the shell would be liberated, and only then they would sound so purely and fine and clear like metal. But you can have just a little idea of these shell rattles or tinkles. And they have found lots of them in Teotihuacan, probably part of ritual garment or necklace. Then there are these rattles, gourd rattles, quite huge ones and quite loud also. They were adorned with feathers and painted. What else? Ah, yes, we are in the rattle section. Little ball rattles, ceramic rattles. By nature, because these rattles are quite small, the sound is very fine and not loud. This is, of course, also something which needs to be taken into account when reconstructing the sound sphere, the soundscapes of the city, where and in which places certain instruments could be heard and where not. For example, these quadruple flutes, they are not actually very loud. They have a very rich sound, lots of microtonal aspects and harmonics in these instruments, but they are not loud. It's more likely that these instruments were played in enclosures, in temples, maybe in small courtyards, but for sure not in the large plazas, which were designed for larger ceremonies or rituals. So this, of course, might also tell us a lot about the certain placement and employment of instruments within the urban configuration of the city. Yes, other instruments are lithophones, which were also found, stone slates. I have one here, played with another stone. There are drums, not so many finds of drums, or let's say so many finds of objects which could be classified of drums, which is really interesting because in the contemporary Maya culture, for example, we already have large triplet drums, wooden drums, slit drums. These are kind of xylophones and other kind of drums, for example, ceramic drums. But for Teotihuacan, there's not so much information about drums. I'm still searching for possible finds of drums, and I discovered this object, which is classified by the archaeologist in a very wide way as a ritual object. So it could be anything. Some archaeologists proposed that it could be part of an incense burner, but of course, it could be a drum. So we produced this one, and it has just this usual drum sound. It's a beautiful object. Just an idea that this could be one of the Teotihuacan drums. Another instrument, yes, I showed that earlier. That's the shell horn, which is fitted here on that image with a ceramic mouthpiece. So we are testing this. I stated this with the very first slide, that in the Teotihuacan images of shell horns, they are always fitted with a mouthpiece, which is quite unusual for Mesoamerica. But for Teotihuacan, apparently it was more frequently the case. So then we have these beautiful guys. These are ocarinas, but very strange ocarinas. They have the acoustic chamber is globular here, but then the globular chamber has two extensions, two tubular extensions with two finger holes each. So it's a strange mix of ocarina and tubular flute, but actually the sound is that of an ocarina, and there's always a monkey figure. And this is also interesting here. That is most probably the ring of a ball game player. That was a ritual game performed in the pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. So maybe these instruments are related with this ball game, which was a ritual game performed by experienced ball game players. The instruments sound like this. So you see also here on the images that we produce instruments in various sizes, and that is also something which is interesting, and applies for all cultures of the pre-Columbian Americas, both Mesoamerica and South America, that there is not that standardization of instrument production as we know it in Europe. Each instrument actually was produced in a certain size range, but the individual size and the individual form of each particular instrument was exclusively. So there is not one instrument which exactly looks and has the exact same dimensions like the other one. And that, of course, also contributes to a certain sound style of the pre-Columbian Americas, because in case of these instruments, and for example, these ball game player ocarinas, they were found all over the site, hundreds and hundreds of fragments of these instruments. So everyone basically played them because they were found in the temples, in the courtyards, in the residential compounds, close to the Sun Pyramid in the very center, and very far away in the periphery of the city. So if you have so many instruments, it's just likely that they were played not as solo instruments, but together. And when played these instruments together, and each instrument has an individual size, then also each instrument has an individual sound range. And it's just by nature that you produce deviations and microtonal effects, beats and the like, which then contributed most likely to that pre-Columbian music, which we are about to reconstruct here. These instruments are really interesting because they are very loud. The ball game players, they are not so loud, but these ones, they are much smaller. These are also ocarinas, polyglobular ocarinas, because actually they have two globular resonance chambers, and they have 3 finger holes. Again, the number of 3, which seems to be so important for Teotihuacan. And I can just give a little impression of this instrument. So that's the sound of these instruments. And again, you see, we produce lots of them, and then get some results also in terms of manufacturing. For example, manufacturing in series produces something in the way how you make things, and we are producing these instruments rapidly, fastly. After once that we discovered how to do it, we make it fast, and because that is also something which we observe in the fragments and in the originals, that certain parts of these instruments are not so accurate in production. There are little rests of ceramic here or there. It's not fully polished here or there. There are remains of something here. So that is also part of this process of making, which we are reproducing and hoping that we come closer actually to the originals in this way. These are also whistles, which have basically the same range than these polyglobular ocarinas before. They are in the shape of little eagles. Just one sound, certainly used for communication. That is a sound which is just heard over a wide area within the city, for sure. But again, we do not know what has been done with them. Then we have these instruments, and that's the final ones which I'm going to show you. And these are whistling vessels. Also in Mesoamerica, whistling vessels were produced. They are more known for South American cultures, but also Mesoamerica, whistling vessels were known. And basically all cultures in Mesoamerica produced whistling vessels, but at a somewhat minor scale. In Teotihuacan, there are two types of these instruments. One has two cylindrical recipients or vessels. One of them is closed, so it looks like a lid, but it's only simulating a lid. It cannot be taken away. And on top of that false lid is situated a little monkey figure. And in this monkey figure, in the head of the monkey, is situated a tiny, tiny, tiny whistle of maybe only 1.2 or 1.4 or even 1 centimeter of diameter. Very high-pitched whistles are these. And something which we figured out in the first reconstructions of these instruments, which we did. So these two ones are the first which we carried out, and we discovered that somehow they didn't work. Something was not well in terms of instrument manufacture, or let's say in terms of instrument design. Then we figured out that the diameter and the length of this little connecting tube, there's always a connecting tube between the chambers. Here, it would be placed here between this little vase and the monkey figure, which is hollow. So that is here. These are double chambered whistling vessels. And the connecting tube would be placed here on the bottom of that instrument, and that is here. And this needs to be, it needs to have a certain length and a certain diameter. If that is not accurately reproduced, the water flow, because actually these instruments work with water or with any other kind of liquid, and the water flow would not generate enough pressure. It would flow too slowly, for example, or not fast enough in order to generate pressure, because there is remaining air inside the closed vessel, which has this little whistle in the head. Also, this type has the little whistle in the head, and the remaining air in that chamber, when you fill water in here, is then pushed towards this whistle, and so then the sound apparatus is activated. The whistle is activated. So that is something that we figured out. There is a certain technology involved here, which is certainly hydraulic technology, and then also air pressure, and lots of technological components involved here in these instruments. And the achievement to produce these instruments is interesting. Also, a factor is the size of the vessel. If you have a large whistling vessel, it's much easier to produce the sound of it, because you have a larger amount of liquid which you would fill into the vessel, and therefore also the air pressure generated, it's just more easy to generate a certain amount of pressure which is needed to activate the whistle. In smaller whistling vessels, such as the ones of Teotihuacan, this is much more difficult. Then you would need to produce tiny, tiny whistles in such an accurate way that with the tiniest movement of air, with the tiniest airflow, the whistle is activated. So we produced first little models of these whistles. Here you see the aperture. The whistle actually is the head of the little monkey. And we produced, I don't know how many of them, until we found the right configuration so that the activation is just with the and it sounds. And that's this. I'm nearly not blowing. And the whistle sounds. All these different factors need to be taken into account in the production of these instruments. Now, There are several types of them and several models of them, which we all reproduced. So this one here is this one. It has this flower motif here. It has, again, the little monkey here on top, and water is already in. And now I move the instrument and you will hear the sound. Now, after a while that I was talking, the ceramic absorbed water, and there is probably, yeah, you see, there was just this little amount of water needed to generate a little bit more pressure so that the whistle sounds better. And that's it. I don't know if you hear it, but in the back movement, air is again sucked into the whistle. And that means that, again, there is enough air for the activation, but also that during this process of sucking air in, you hear respiration. So these objects actually live. They are breathing. This is a breathing sound, and I don't know if you actually hear it because it's very delicate sound. You also notice water sounds, of course. Probably you're not going to listen that, but you listen to this little chirping figure. And now, yes, this is something that I just wanted to add to this particular one, because we found this is the original, which is stored in the Ethnographical Museum of Stockholm. It was excavated in the 40s by Swedish archaeologists in Teotihuacan, one of the first really well-documented excavations. And it has, astonishingly and surprisingly, 3 little stone pellets inside the closed chamber. That is something that I never found in other whistling vessels of both Americas. And I analyzed, I don't know, I had in my hand maybe 150 or 200 different original whistling vessels. Not in one we observed this, but this one has these 3 stone pellets. Again, the number of 3. So there might be a symbolic value here. And of course, the stone pellets also produce a sound. So when I put the water out of it, it's a rattle. Okay, that's the particular thing of this one. And now, here you see the movement of the whistling vessels. I'm now a little bit adjust because I just wanted to show you this one, and that's even smaller whistle. And I have to add a little bit of water again here. Look how small this vessel is. It's actually the smallest whistling vessel which I could document so far in all of the Americas. It's just 10.5 centimeters high, and the amount of water is just 100 milliliters. That's basically nothing. So to produce this in a way that it sounds is really challenging. These people there in Teotihuacan, somehow they made it. We now also made it, and but it was a process, you can imagine. Now, oops, I covered the hole with water, and then of course the sound is muted. There, here we go. It has a little triller effect, interestingly. So when there is a little amount of water coming into the aperture of the whistle, usually it would be fully muted. But with this instrument, interestingly, it's not the case. It produces a triller effect. So there are still lots of mysteries here to be solved. For sure, these are instruments which are not played in large open areas, that must be played in small rooms, in temple rooms maybe. We do not know what kind of liquid was employed. There are other whistling vessels where you would not need to add a liquid. You could just blow into the vessel and it would sound. But with these instruments, it's not possible because the diameter of the vessels is just too big. You would need to cover it and it just doesn't work. So these are most likely played with a liquid, but of course we do not know. It's not analysis taken out so far what kind of liquid was used. It could be water, it could be any kind of sacred liquid, it could be ritual beverages, hallucinogenic beverages, it could be blood, it could be so many different kind of liquids, alcoholic beverages employed here. Then maybe in a certain ritual also that liquid was consumed. So you can imagine kind of rituals where also the consumption of that liquid was employed. So we have sound, movement, and consumption. But these are all just eventualities, and we really do not know because, again, there's no depiction of such instrument found in Teotihuacan. So here I just show you the size. On the left, you see a conventional South American whistling vessel from the Moche culture, which is so huge in comparison to this very, very small whistling vessel of Teotihuacan. Imagine the amount of liquid here and the amount of pressure generated to activate the whistle, which is really makes a big difference. Also an aspect which we just only discovered in this process of reconstructing. So that is basically the end of my lecture. And I thank you very much that you all joined my presentation. And now I did not look at the chat, but I'm now open to all kind of questions which you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Adje. I don't know why I cannot share my video now. Okay, here it is. Thank you, Adje, for this very interesting presentation. Thank you for showing us so many very nice instruments. I think many of us are very, very jealous of the amount of instruments you deal with in Teotihuacan. There are some questions in the chat that I can see. Maybe the people that is present could repeat those questions so we can know to which instruments they were related. For instance, Brian Katz, why not use a piece of reed brass to move it like a slide whistle? I think it means for the flutes you showed.
I think it was something with the piston whistle with this thing, but I don't understand. I don't actually understand what is it about. I don't understand that question.
I think he's not here anymore, and I think he meant why don't you use a reed, for instance, or a stick of grass, so you put it inside and then you move it up and down like like a slider, so the tone changes. I guess it must mean something like that.
Yeah. I just placed the link again, so now you would find it here in my last comment. You can copy it, and then you can just access the album, the digital album. You can just listen to it online. By the way, the fourth piece, as I mentioned, is the one which just has pure quadruple flute recordings, which are then mixed in a certain way. It's a very interesting piece, and the first three pieces are just electronic music with Teotihuacan sounds.
Marga is asking a question in the chat. Maybe she's not. She cannot
Yes.
connect online.
Yes.
I am.
Okay.
I was just not trying not to be. No, I was wondering if when you did this geo-referenced mapping, how do you deal with issues like wind? and I don't know, other things that may influence the recordings that you make?
Well, so far we didn't carry out this.
Okay.
As I explained earlier, it's not possible to travel to Mexico currently due to the current crisis. So we just did some tests on site, only some little playing. I showed that image of me sitting there on the foot of the pyramid playing a quadruple flute, just only to have an idea. We also sounded a shell horn on top of the pyramid, and my friend was standing some 150 meters in front of the pyramid, and we were just making this sign in order to test how far the sound reaches. And of course there was no problem, it was clearly heard. So probably only one shell horn played on top of these pyramids could be heard all over the size. But you are right, when there would be a strong wind, then of course not in all directions. And this needs to be taken into account. In terms of recording, that's not a problem. We can just work with wind protectors, and we would not record disturbing wind sounds, which of course in the recording sounds different and distorted as in naturally listening to accompanying wind sound. What I want to do is, of course, and I missed to say this, we also include just conventional soundscape recordings of the natural environment. So we are also, when then we are able to be in Teotihuacan, we will have recording slots of 1 week and different times of a day. We are going to record the wind, we are going to record the humidity, which also has a large effect, of course, on sound propagation. We record the place where the instrument is sounded, and we record the place where the instrument is recorded. So that will be all geo-referenced. And we also will record the soundscape. So if then during the rainy period of the year, there's lots of thunder sounds in the site and rain sounds in the site. And in the rainy period, there are other birds in the site than during the dry period. So we are trying to capture the current soundscape of the site in terms of the sounds of the natural environment, both atmospheric and animal. And of course, we are going to research what kind of animals already existed in the valley of Teotihuacan during the time of the occupation of the culture, and extrapolate also this. But sounds of thunder and rain and wind would always have been there, and they always had a meaning. The wind and the thunder was related to the rain god, and so on. So that must be included in any kind of sound simulation, sound imaging, which we are going to carry out in Teotihuacan. If that is a good reply to your question, Marga?
Yeah, it is. It's a question that people usually make us. So that's why I wanted to, in this case, ask you and see how other people were dealing with it.
Yes.
Thank you, Adje. I have also so many questions for you, but first of all, as you have shared with us a link, I'm trying to figure out what you have sent. But then when I click the link, I see things in a language I cannot recognize. So is this Casnotieja thing?
Yes, and you see 4 tracks.
Oh,
it's Polish.
Okay, yeah.
These are Polish people. So if I now click on the 4th track,
yeah,
and do you?
Yeah.
So that's.
Okay. I was wondering that maybe it was not the right link or something. Okay, thank you.
No, it's the correct one.
Okay. We we're a little late, but Marga, do you think I could ask some things to Adje? Okay.
Of course, yes.
Okay. Well, first, I'm quite curious about the chronology because you have so many findings, and Teotihuacan was a religious site for so many time. I was wondering if these instruments are contemporary to each other, because there's a huge amount of them. So I imagine that they change through time, the type of instruments that they are using, and if you can see a pattern of changing, whether it's cultural, or it's sound related, or it's a change in aesthetics, or it may be a change in, I don't know, ontology, or any type of influence from whatever that could explain the modifications, if there are any, in this instrumental register.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that for most instrument types, I have an astonishing continuity. So let's say these little guys here, these ball player ocarinas, they are found in all stratigraphic layers of the city, all over the site, and they are always the same. So there might be differences in the decoration, in the way that, let's say, color is applied to them, but the basic form is just for several hundred years the same. And that's the case for most. Sorry?
And the tuning and some qualities as well.
Yeah. There are some instruments where I could probably establish development through time, and this is regarding the whistling vessels. But so certain whistling vessels are produced in a certain ceramic type, which is more later Teotihuacan than earlier Teotihuacan. But unfortunately here I do not have enough finds in order to get a closer view on this. Shell horns all over, from the earliest period in Teotihuacan to the latest periods, always the same type of shells used, always fitted with mouthpieces. By the way, in the archaeological records, there was not one find so far with a mouthpiece, or with an object which could be a mouthpiece. That is interesting. But in the murals, there is, from the earliest murals on to the latest murals on, they are always fitted with mouthpieces. So basically, I do not have many instruments where I could see a development, and that is interesting because we are talking about a culture of some 500, 600 years.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Before I keep asking you, there's another very interesting question in the chat. Milcar Vargas asks, thanks you for the presentation, and wonders what have been the dissemination activities for local communities and local indigenous people who live around Teotihuacan.
Yeah, okay. Local indigenous people are not there, actually. So this area is just populated by mestizo people, like Mexican, just conventional Mexicans, no indigenous ethnic population there. It might change a little bit when going up into the mountains. In the mountain ranges over there, there are certain tribes, but they are not at all related to Teotihuacan. They have nothing to do with Teotihuacan. And Teotihuacan is also not a place like other archaeological sites in Mexico, which are still subject of ritual activities of indigenous populations. So the site is actually occupied by modern tourists and Mexicans, but let's say more urban Mexican populations, tourists, urban tourists, Mexican tourists from Mexico City and elsewhere who are traveling to Teotihuacan. And very interesting aspect is that this old ceremonial site of Teotihuacan over the last few decades became a new ritual precinct of modern age neo-shamanic people who are traveling especially to the equinox to the equinoxes to Teotihuacan, believing in certain cosmic powers and energies which is inherent into these large pyramidal structures, and belief into cosmic forces which are and then are adopted. And there is all kind of neo-shamanic and neo-religious activity taking on in Teotihuacan. There are also rituals taking place in Teotihuacan, but this is urban populations which are traveling there, and in which also sound is involved. So this old ritual precinct becomes there are layers of rituals in different times, because that is not something which is just so new, because when Teotihuacan was destroyed around 750 BC, a few hundred years later, the Aztecs came and not far away built their capital, Tenochtitlan, in the Valley of Mexico, and still traveled to Teotihuacan from time to time in order to make offerings. So that ritual precinct, the nature of ritual activities carried out there is a development until now. And of course, I'm also vaguely including this kind of sound, contemporary ritual sound performed on the site. It's a sidetrack analysis, but it's a quite interesting thing, of course, to observe. And what I also wanted to say is related to this, that there is lots of local sellers of tourist products in the site of Teotihuacan, and among these tourist products are quite adventurous pre-Columbian instruments in all kind of strange forms. They have nothing to do with actual pre-Columbian instruments or Teotihuacan instruments, but they are like whistles in the shape of jaguars and strange flutes with heads attached and so on. Lots of tourists are buying these instruments, and the sellers of them are constantly playing on them in the site. So there is a constant sound sphere in the site, played on flutes and whistles and other instruments which are not Teotihuacan sounds, but it's also there. That is also something which could be analyzed, but it's also something which is disturbing, because all the time there is some guy playing some strange whistle around. So we can only perform our sound analysis on site very early in the morning, or very late in the afternoon, or even at times when the site is not open to the public.
I guess, Adje, that, sorry, Raquel, I guess that part of your project, but I guess that you are going to run out of time, would be that you teach local population of how the instruments were, and that you create value. So, in fact, Amilcar has written a PhD in which he has been interviewing people of Teotihuacan. So that's why that was his interest. But I think that perhaps this debate could be, I mean, that I will put you both in contact so that you can learn from what he has learned about Teotihuacan, and perhaps give you some ideas of people that you can contact, and perhaps create wealth in the local population thanks to your research.
I would like to do so, but it's a tricky business, because the Mexican Institute of Archaeology, which is a stately organization, is really keeping an eye in terms of reproduction of archaeological objects. So they are really trying to control the, let's say, commercialization of archaeological objects. And I'm submitted the kind of rules. For example, I'm not allowed to publish precise measurements. because there is a very strict control. And of course I thought, and I showed to one of the sellers, by the way, he took me to his workshop on the other day, which was there on top of nearly on the slope of one of these mountains, where I was able to take this photo of this whole valley of Teotihuacan, and we became kind of friends. He is producing instruments. And I thought a lot, will I show him these instruments? It's difficult, because I'm risking that then a new culture is produced on the basis of my research, and it evolves in the strangest ways. I experienced this also with already with other instruments which I researched, and these are these Aztec death whistles, and it's a whole neo-shamanic culture which is now produced on top of my research, and the most strangest fake news are produced on this, and I don't like this. But it's a very interesting question, of course.
I was also going to say that also you told me that you are facing a lot of difficulties with Mexican authorities, in terms that even if you are planning this research for people to have an immersive experience in Teotihuacan, know more about the past, know more about the music, respect the natural soundscapes and everything, you are not having a lot of help from Mexican institutions. So maybe this retribution to local communities is even harder when you have to face so many bureaucratic business with the authorities.
Yeah, well, it was. I'm now still in the process of establishing a contract, which is now going to be signed between the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Mexico and my university in Huddersfield. It's like it's settled so high, and we are like settling in this moment a cooperation contract in which all these kind of things are settled. And in the course of this contract negotiations, it was first stated that if I want to produce accurate replicas of these instruments, I would need to pay for each individual object an incredible amount of money. And I was really thinking, oh, of course I have certain budgets, but they should be the expenditure should be done for something else, and not for paying Mexican authorities to carry out my research, which is again something for Mexico. I'm bringing some results to the Mexican people there, of course. So I was really negotiating a lot, and finally I was I'm now stating that I produce not accurate models in terms of surface. So I will produce forms which sound accurately like the originals, but I'm not producing the exact forms. The designs will be different. So we are applying more abstract shapes. For example, in these objects here, they should be quite accurate, but now we are producing a more abstract shape of this little monkey figure, and then I would not need to pay. So it's crazy.
In the end, this is the sound what it's important.
Yeah, for me it's totally okay.
I don't know if we have more questions.
We had a comment by Nehemias, but perhaps he can put his camera on and his microphone on.
I will. He's a presenter, so he can speak if he wants.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
And just to say congratulations for the use of experimental archaeology in your research. I work a lot with experimental archaeology, and I always stress that it's a very important method to perform a good interpretation of the archaeological record. So just this short comment.
Yeah, and it's just interesting, of course. So we are learning such an incredible amount of information just in doing and in experimenting, and then also when it comes to music and musicians performing these instruments. It's another step on top of that, of course. So this is just, I call it, it's a research, of course, it's proper scientific research, but it's also really a very interesting adventure, which we are carrying out here.
May I have a final question, if there are not other questions by people that have joined us today. I'm also very curious about any information on the ontology that may have led to this flourishing of wind instruments, whistles, ocarinas. I know it's all over the place in both Americas also, but can it be related at all with the soundscapes, with birds, with a vision of birds as other than human beings? Do we have any information at all on that, or are there any living traditions that may recall any of this?
This is it's a complex issue. So for us, lots of the sounds generated vaguely remind birds. Now this little triller here, again, water is absorbed. Oh, it's not sounding now. It stopped sounding. It wants to stop. Stop it now. Okay, no, we have this impression of birds maybe, but that impression might be very different in the pre-Columbian Americas. So the sound aesthetics, of course, is differently shaped. We are socialized in a certain way, and we see this. For example, we hear bird sounds in such instruments, but there's a monkey figure, actually, and monkeys do not produce. Maybe that is something which I would need to explore now. It's always the same monkey that is identified. It's the spider monkey. It's a Central American species, the spider monkey, which is also documented for South Mexico, Maya area. And so that spider monkey, I would need to research the sounds of that spider monkey. Maybe in certain moments the monkey generates such sound, but most frequently in these whistling vessels they show an image of something, and the sound is just something else. So there are lots of symbolic issues involved here and meanings. The sound itself always was perceived as a kind of offering, kind of communication with the spiritual world, kind of relation to the dead, to the gods, and certain sounds had certain purposes, for sure. Why there are so many wind instruments is also related with the fact that they were produced from ceramics, and lots of instruments which are not produced on ceramics just simply didn't survive. So we also get maybe a wrong impression of the diversity of instruments in the pre-Columbian Americas. But for sure, there are lots of wind instruments, and for sure, it's not just only birds.
Thank you. Anyone else? And do we know if they were locally made? Did we find kilns in Teotihuacan, or maybe they were brought by pilgrims and people from all over? Or
yes, instruments. There are certain instruments which are produced from Teotihuacan ceramics, so that's local production. So these cylindrical trumpets or these ones here, that's local ceramics. Lots of whistling vessels were actually produced in Puebla, also in central Mexico, but a little bit farther away from Teotihuacan. And Teotihuacan was controlling the commercial activity with that ceramics. And ceramic was produced in Teotihuacan style. So these are entities which were related to Teotihuacan, and we do not know yet if all the ceramics was just produced in Puebla, some 100 kilometers away, and then just brought to Teotihuacan and then distributed all over Mesoamerica until the Maya zone. Or how that worked, we don't know, but we know that Teotihuacan controlled commercial activity related with this ceramic type. And certain instruments like these, several of these whistling vessels are produced from that ceramic type. And we have finds in Oaxaca, in the Maya area. So we see that Teotihuacan exported sound instruments and also exported probably the relations with them, the symbolic values of these instruments to other cultures. On the other way, other cultures exported also their instruments to Teotihuacan. For example, this thing here, this piston whistle thing, is not originated in Teotihuacan. That is something which earlier there was a comment that they are also found in Oaxaca. But they are also found in Veracruz, and somehow this instrument type managed its way to Teotihuacan, and then it was kind of reproduced. There's one find of a Maya whistling vessel in Teotihuacan. So there are lots of relations with other cultures, and of course we can only understand this in looking at this site in its wider geographical and cultural context of interrelations with contemporary societies. And that's again also part of my research and quite interesting, because so far we do not know what kind of people lived in Teotihuacan, what kind of language they spoke. And we know that several ethnic groups had areas in Teotihuacan where they settled. There is an Oaxaca barrio. There is Maya presence in Teotihuacan. There are tombs in one of the pyramids where we found Maya rulers in Teotihuacan in these large pyramids. Still, we didn't find a tomb of a Teotihuacan ruler. These Maya guys were certainly not the rulers of Teotihuacan because they were captured. They had the arms on their back and they were probably sacrificed, but they were so high-ranking officials that they were buried in tombs in the Moon Pyramid. So there are still lots of mini mysteries in Teotihuacan, and maybe we can add some hints in terms of music relationships here.
It's really amazing. It's a great site.
I think that we've been now 2 hours here, and probably we need to stop, which is, I think, it has been a great talk.
Thank you.
And from the Artsoundscapes project, I really thank you. We have videoed, as we mentioned at the start, the talk, and as soon as we can, we will be making a link to your seminar on the webpage. And so Raquel, I'll leave you to say the last words, and we probably need to stop after you.
I'm experimenting problems with the connection right now, but I hope you hear me. Yes, I want to thank you. Thanks everyone present. I want to remind some people of the ISMA that I see here and all colleagues and friends that we organize from time to time this seminar in the Artsoundscape project, and from now on we will inform you about these nice online meetings that we are going to have from now on. Thank you very much, Adje, and I will probably bomb you with all of this in private.
Yes. Please, you all have my emails in the chat. So if someone doesn't have my email so far and wants to get in contact with me about something, just write. And maybe then in the future we are also able to meet in person again and play some instruments together.
Yes.
Nice.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation. It was a pleasure. to give you an update of my current research. Unfortunately, not the archaeoacoustic thing so far, due to the current crisis, not able, but it will hopefully come.
Yes. Thank you very much. And
Okay.
thank you everybody for attending
Thank you.
this seminar. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.